Hi, it's Larold, and Toxic Rain Pathfinder has gone through quite a few changes with the big patch 3.25 reveal, and I'm going to go through and break them down, talk about what I think of them, and give my updated Toxic Rain Pathfinder League Start POB, which is, I think, looking pretty good. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, I kind of want to start with the nerfs, and I think the most important thing, the thing that everybody really kind of fixated on right off the bat and kind of predicted was coming, was nerfs to Fizz to Ellie conversion. Taste of Hate no longer gives Fizz into cold damage. Purity Watcher's Eyes no longer have Fizz converted into elemental damage. There's just a lot of nerfs to that. Lightning Coil still exists and functions, but it's basically the only way that you can get any Fizz to Ellie conversion, and it's not really that great just on its own. Also, Divine Blessing support. Divine Blessing was just completely removed. So you're no longer able to have like permanent availability on an extra aura just by having Energy Shield, and that's probably for the best. There were some pretty substantial buffs as well, and those really came in the form of fixes to something that I've really hated for a long time, which is mana cost reduction. This isn't like huge. It's a 10 mana cost instead of 11 for Toxic Rain. But Toxic Rain has a pretty prohibitive mana cost, and so reducing that, even just that one flat mana cost reduction, once you factor in all the support gems that come into play, I think your ultimate mana cost is like 271% higher than the base. So this winds up being more like 3 to 4 flat mana reduction, which with how quickly you attack with Toxic Rain and all of the other mods that are possible, this actually winds up being pretty significant. There's also this new passive over here, this new passive Wheel Thrill of Battle, that gives you a lot of mana cost reduction, especially in conjunction with, Searing Exarch, Helm Implicit, that gives you around 24, 25, 26% mana cost with attacks reduction. Then you factor in this wheel as well, and kind of to spoil something later on, it's actually possible to switch over to the mana version of this build without a Clarity Watcher's Eye, without really all that much investment. You'll be at end game and have in-game gear, but it's actually pretty doable now, and that is a pretty significant buff. So in terms of the character progression, all the stuff from Act 1 all the way through your Uber Lab is completely identical, totally unchanged. I wouldn't change anything from starting the character all the way through doing like Uber Lab and even making it till around level 90. That is when I would start mixing things up a bit, and the main reasons that I would do this is I've made a couple of gear changes to the build. Obviously, you can see I'm emphasizing Wind Dancer here, and that's true with gear as well. I think that switching back over to Kintsugi, this was something that was in vogue for a long time before Lightning Coil kind of took over, and I think we need to go back. I think it's time to go back. Kintsugi gives you this massive damage reduction effect if you haven't been hit within the last 4 seconds. Evasion, it's a complicated mechanic in Path of Exile, but the way it works basically is it's not a true chance. You have sort of a ramping build up. If you've ever played a Brewmaster Monk in World of Warcraft, this is exactly like Brewmaster Monk's Mastery, where you basically get a stacking dodge chance until you dodge. That is how it works with Evasion and Path of Exile. You have a chance each time you get attacked, but then each time that you don't get attacked, that chance continues to rise. And Wind Dancer makes it so that you have less damage taken if you haven't been hit recently by an attack, more evade chance if you have been hit recently by an attack. Now, there is obviously the downside of taking more damage if you've been hit by an attack, but you have so much more evade chance, and your evade chance is very high that you are going to be evading lots and lots of attacks. So it's not necessarily something you have to take, but the synergy between Wind Dancer and Kintsugi is very good. This also makes resistances way easier to fix. I've left Lightning Coil in the build. You can play with it. I think the cost on it's probably going to be low, because I think most people are probably going to not be trying to do Fizz converting into Ellie, since this is basically one of the only 2 options you really have left. And, Kintsugi may go up in price. That certainly is a possibility, but this is kind of the direction I would want to go. Ultimately, I think my long-term in-game goal is actually just to rock one of the new evasion bases that I believe are not in PoB yet. Just one of the super, super high evasion bases with all the stuff you would normally expect. Life, evasion, maybe crafted max life on the prefix, and then just suppression and resistances and stats and stuff on the suffixes. With that being said, I think Kintsugi will definitely get you kind of into in-game, into tier 16s pretty effectively. And as I said, it doesn't have the minus 60 lightning res on it. Instead, it has positive fire res. That's pretty good. It also has, as you can see, just a massive amount of evasion, like 2,300 evasion. And with evasion rating from quality now being more multiplier instead of increased, that does have a lot of value. There's also this that you can use, this life mastery, 15% increased max life if there are no life mods on your equipped body armor, and Kintsugi just has evasion, fire res, and then the 2 unique mods. So no life mod on it at all. And that's pretty, 15% max life is huge. So this is actually like a lot of life, 250 flat life by adding this into kind of an in-game build. That's a lot. This also makes it so that evasion is just a lot stronger. You can use a Jade Flask, for example. I have that in one of my setups here. A Jade Flask is giving me, I'm in the 80% evade chance range in what would probably be realistically like day 2 gear, day 3 gear. That's very, very evasive. You are weaker against unavoidable fizz hits like boss slams, but you're stronger against everything else. And so I guess what I'm really saying here is just don't get hit. Now to talk about the Flask Changes a bit more, Taste of Hate is obviously gone. There's no reason to run that in the build anymore. You can run Magic Sapphire and Magic Topaz Flasks. As you can see, I am literally doing a Magic Sapphire Flask just because my cold res is like not fixed in this and I didn't want to go through every single piece of gear and kind of sort that out. But also they are still really good for blue altar farming. So you can run Quicksilver and Silver Flask, and then Sapphire and Topaz Flask, just magic ones. You'll actually get more effect out of them than you would have out of the Taste of Hate due to Nature's Boon giving you 30% increased effect. So it's not all downside. It will make you stronger against all that elemental damage, and that's good. There's also potential I have in the config tab here. I'll delete this before I'm done, but this is something you could do if you're playing around. You can type in like plus 200 plus 200% to all res. You want to type it with the correct syntax. If you're not in if you don't have the custom mods tab open, if it's working correctly, it'll show as blue, and then you can just like hash that out. And then if it's in red, then it means it's not working. And so you can do like this just to play around with stuff. So if I were to drop the Sapphire Flask for a Stibnite Flask, which is something I was playing around with. Stibnite Flask makes it so that you throw a smoke cloud around yourself, which does blind enemies. Not hugely valuable, but it gives you more evasion rating. It lasts a pretty long time, as you can see as well. And, looking at this really pushes the evasion rating up quite a bit more. Now, this is like kind of the budget-ish character. If we push into sort of a more high budget with like Tides of Time, and we were to look at that, like Jade and Stibnite together, we can be pushing pretty close to 90% evade chance, especially if we then turn on enemies being blinded. Then we're sitting at like 90% evade chance, which is very high, very, very, very high. So that is a possibility. Not necessarily something that you are going to want to do. I think Stibnite Flask has a lot less value than running, Jade Flask or even like Sapphire or Topaz. Now, with all this emphasis on evasion, you can get blind on hit as a dexterity tattoo. This is really simple. You just swap out one of your dexterity nodes with, I can't remember what they're named, Tattoo of the Tessalio Warrior. You just swap one of those out, 5% chance to blind on hit with attacks. Totally optional, but it does work. I did play around with like a 2-link in game. I have them right here, a level 1 Toxic Rain, a level 1 Blind Support, and I just went and like shot some monsters in the quarry, and the handful of ones that didn't die, that did get hit by the pods popping, were blinded. The only downside with this is that the pods do have to pop in order for that Toxic Rain to count as a hit. So this isn't great for the vast majority of situations. You're not going to get blind on stuff. It's going to be dead, but it can work for big rares and uniques where the pods last long enough. Don't think this is great, but it is something, Dex is really not all that great either. So it is something you could do to get just a little bit of Dex and get yourself quite a bit of evade chance. It's like 3% more evade chance. Progenesis is still the big chase unique flask, just to kind of show that off, Not really surprising. Progenesis is worth an absolutely insane amount of Fizz max hit, and of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? it's insanely strong, especially if you're combining it with the Tides of Time, which makes it so that you can have easy 100% uptime, and then you're also getting like massively increased effect on it as well. Great belt. This is still like your chase unique belt as well. None of this has changed. I do still think this is better than Mage Blood, but with the possibility of playing a mana build, it is definitely an option to do a Mage Blood build, and that can give you a bit more speed out of the Silver and Quicksilver Flask, a little bit more evasion out of like a Jade Flask, or resistances out of a Topaz or Sapphire. Optional, not necessarily something I would do, but optional for sure. So all of this stuff about Flask being said, I think the build is actually going to feel pretty tanky for how zoomy it is, and I think it'll actually feel more tanky against mods like Fizz's extra elemental damage, because evasion with, well, you know, I don't have it in this build right here, but like with the Jade Flask giving you so much more evade chance, I really think that you're going to actually feel a lot more tanky against some of those very rippy mods like Fizz's extra lightning damage or fire or cold. Because you're going to be evading so many more hits, you're going to be taking so many fewer hits at a time, and you will need to be more careful with big physical slams, but there really isn't that much huge Fizz max hit or chaos max hit stuff in the game. The big max hit stuff is pretty much always elemental damage, and I think there's some stuff we can do to help with that a lot. All right, now to move on to auras. Divine Blessing support is gone, so we really have a couple of options for dealing with this. I think option number one, the easiest one, is just to have one fewer aura. And I think we can live with that by dropping Purity of Elements. Now, as soon as you're transitioning into the end game, you could still rock with like Purity, Grace, and Skitterbots initially as you're getting your resistances up from the absolute garbage can level, but once your resistances are like out of the toilet, you can switch over to like Haste and Malevolence, and then once you have enough reservation efficiency through the tree, you can drop Skitterbots and just run Grace, Haste, and Malevolence as your 3 auras, and that can definitely work as you're progressing into the tree or into the end game. That totally functions. I think that works pretty well. I do think it's a lot easier to manage dropping Purity of Elements out of the tree since we're using Kintsugi as our starter instead of Lightning Coil. That, you know, that swing of 90 resistances between Lightning Coil and Kintsugi is basically a full Purity of Elements. So that works. We are able to fix our elemental ailment issues by just running Brine King. We can switch over to Storm Shroud later on at kind of a higher budget. We have a couple of options. We can do Storm Shroud. That works. We can also do, what is it called? Ancestral Vision, I believe. If I look this up here, Ancestral Vision is another jewel that you can use. This also works. It gives you roughly, it'll give you like 50% ailment avoidance. And so then you have to fix that up in a couple of other ways. You can get that through an Essence Boot craft. You can also take this thick skin wheel and then like maybe get some ailment avoidance elsewhere. Take this crystal skin wheel or something. I don't really want to do that, but you know, I think it's definitely possible. I think Ancestral Vision's probably worse. It's usually cheaper than Storm Shroud because it requires more work to make it function. You know, I think what you can do, generally speaking, is just do Storm Shroud, which gives you the chance to avoid being like, or avoid all ailments that's equal to your chance to avoid being shocked. And then you just run a flask, a Bog Moss flask, something that has the chance to avoid being shocked as a suffix and then has 100% uptime. And then you have enough flask effect on it so that that chance will be 100%, and then you're good to go. Now, there's another way to deal with not having that aura as well. You can use Guardian's Blessing support to keep Malevolence alive, and I have set this up here in-game with a very basic setup. I had to pay a Divine to buy, where is it here? I had to pay a Divine to buy a 20 Spectre from somebody, and the 20 quality was totally irrelevant. So what you can do is you don't have to run Desecrate in order to do this. You can, like, just to give the basic rundown of how Guardian's Blessing support works, it is instant and free, which is good. And you link it to a minion skill and an aura skill. And the way it works is when you have a minion that has like a health pool, a minion that can be attacked and I don't know, last permanently, I believe, you can use that aura, and then it will start draining the minion's health. And it'll give you that aura, and it's free, and it's instant, and you can turn it on and off, and that's how it works. Now, when the minion's health hits 0, it dies. Normal video game stuff. We can get around this because it looks like Ritual is bringing back the Dark Marionette minions from Affliction League, which res themselves upon death. There are 3 tiers, there's Imperfect, Regular, and Perfect. I don't really care about it being the good ones that do like damage when they die. Like, that's fine, damage when they die. Scorching is irrelevant for our build. We can actually just go with the cheap one, just a crappy Imperfect Dark Marionette that just reforms after it dies. This means all you have to do to maintain the aura is get one of these Imperfect Dark Marionettes, throw it on the ground, raise it with res it with Raise Spectre, and then never replace that Spectre gem, never take it off, and then just, you know, every time the buff falls off, you smack it again, which it's instant and free, so that's really not very difficult to do. That's it. And if for some reason you lose your Spectre, you can bring it back by doing as I have done here in my hideout, slapping down a Desecrate and then raising the Spectre, and then that'll do. I think that works correctly. I'm not a corpse guy. I don't love this strategy personally, since it is a bit fiddly and it requires playing around with corpses. I didn't like corpses even before Necropolis League. I definitely don't like them now, but it is an option. It's something that a lot of people will do. But it is contingent on these Dark Marionette corpses coming back with Ritual and working at the way that they did in Affliction League, both of which may not be true. So we'll see. This may wind up all being wrong, but it is definitely at the time I'm saying this, I'm not stupid. I may be proven dumb later. But wait, there's more. There is a new 3-point mana reservation efficiency node between the Ranger and Duelist starting points. Duelist over here and Ranger over here. That grants 20% reservation efficiency between Leader of the Pack and reservation efficiency, small passive node. And then there's also this mana mastery from this node that you take, this sort of small cluster here. You can get mana mastery from that, and you can also take sovereignty for mana reservation efficiency from that as well. Between all of this, you get enough reservation efficiency that you can fit in Petrified Blood while still running Haste, Grace, and Malevolence, while only using an Enlighten level 3. Is this something I want to do? Do I want to fit in Petrified Blood? I mean, on the one hand, it does offer a lot of extra Fizz max hit, and also Fire, Cold, and Lightning and Chaos max hit, so it does give you a lot of tankiness. But on the downside, it does add a pretty significant life cost. It also adds a big strength requirement. That's not something I'm totally in love with. It's an option you can pursue. I think a lot of people will, but for me, I think I'm more interested in doing Flesh and Stone. Flesh and Stone has gotten reworked. It's not reworked in PoB yet, but it is still a 25% reservation instead of 35. So that means you don't necessarily need this mana mastery. You can kind of free that point up and still be operating around the same amount of unreserved mana. And that means that that passive is there as an option if you're having to kind of make some compromises elsewhere with your gear. But Flesh and Stone has gotten a redesign. If we pull up the patch notes, Flesh and Stone. It no longer causes blind or anything like that. Instead, the way it works is it does some damage, some melee or whatever fizz damage with blood stance, that doesn't matter. In sand stance, it gives you 10% less damage from nearby enemies, and then that scales up to 19%. And these are auras, so presumably that's increased by all of your possible aura effect, which means I think roughly you would get about 25% less damage from any enemies that are in melee range. I think that's more than enough to be worth the price. 25% less damage taken, roughly. You just stay in sand stance all the time. I think that's great. Also, Flesh and Stone, the sand stance, has some pretty good MTX, so I like that a lot. And as you can see, the strength requirement, not that bad. 98, very doable. Now, Arctic Armor is also an option, but it has a standing still requirement. If I type this in, Arctic Armor, it gives you less fizz and fire damage taken while stationary. It also causes you to be freeze immune, which is okay, but you're going to get freeze and all ailment immunity elsewhere. And so I think this is probably not as good since it doesn't do anything to help with cold and lightning and chaos damage, whereas Flesh and Stone will. It's just all damage is reduced. I think that's pretty good. You know, the only thing I would maybe be concerned about is just the area on it, but you do get some increased area of effect by taking this wheel, 12% and 20%. I think that, along with the area of effect that you already have in the build, I think is enough to make that sand stance be pretty good. You know, if it really came down to it, you could even take this area of effect of Aura Skills Reservation Mastery node. Don't think that's good, don't think that's worth it, but it is something you could consider. All right, now I'm going to talk about the biggest buff to Toxic Rain this league, mana. The base cost of Toxic Rain was reduced by 1. which has the knock-on effect of bringing it down to more like -4, once you have it linked up to 5 support gems. Already talked about this, blah, blah, blah. This is huge. GGG has also added this new wheel on the right-hand side of the tree, right here, the Thrill of Battle wheel. If you take all of these points, you get 35% reduced mana cost. That's enormous. Even if you just take the 2 nodes, if you combine that with a Searing Exarch Helm implicit, this right here, 24% reduced mana cost of attacks, and then these 2 nodes, and then what do I have here? I think I have 2 rings with -7 mana cost, and then an amulet with -8. It's a quality up amulet. I'm sitting at 2 mana cost for my Toxic Rain. That means my average cost for Toxic Rain is only 12 mana per second. That works, right? That is, I generate more than enough mana, regen close to 19 mana per second. So I'm totally able to make the mana work, and it's completely fine. This means that switching out of Eldritch Battery and into mana is surprisingly easy. Now, I still think you want to start out as Eldritch Battery. I think you want to go Eldritch Battery and potentially Diadem as the sort of getting into the end game, getting into clearing tier 16s, doing your initial pinnacle bosses and getting all 4 Void Stones, and then make that swap over once you've had a chance to farm up Eldritch currency, get your jewelry in such a state that you're able to have all of this mana cost reduction. But that does mean that it is like pretty doable to make the swap over to mana. Now, there was one nerf here. The Life Mastery that converts 30% of your mana cost into life cost was reduced to only 15%. This is the only nerf, and I just think it means that you don't mess with this at all anymore. I think you just go with like other nodes, because that is really not that great, and you get so much mana cost reduction on attacks elsewhere that you can zero them out pretty easily with the new full Thrill of Battle wheel and good rings and amulets. I think the critical thing here is that in doing all of this and taking Thrill of Battle and having the rings and the helm and all of that stuff situated and getting down to a mana cost that's workable, I'm not using a Clarity Watcher's Eye to pull this off. I'm using a nice, juicy Malevolence Watcher's Eye, a damage-oriented one. You don't need that Clarity Watcher's Eye. You don't need clarity in order to make this work. If you're able to get your hands on one for cheap, you can do that, and then that'll allow you to alleviate some pressure elsewhere. This is huge for quality of life. You can run a Mana Forged Arrow setup in your body armor and get a ton of power pretty easily without needing the Clarity Watcher's Eye, without needing to make huge sacrifices in order to pull it off. And then you really have 2 options for that 6-link Mana Forged Arrow setup. You can do the kind of utility setup where you do a Toxic Rain of Withering setup, and then you run. It doesn't have to be Toxic Rain of Withering. It can just be regular Toxic Rain, but you're not going to get huge damage out of it. I think getting guaranteed 15 Wither stacks all the time is probably better. And then you link that up with like Mana Forged Arrows, GMP, and Culling Strike. And then you can use Frenzy and Ensnaring Arrow just to guarantee Frenzy charges all the time, and Ensnaring Arrow to give yourself just like slower enemies and kind of more damage on those enemies. That is all really effective. That's the utility setup. Or you can do a Caustic Arrow setup, and in that case, I would link that up with Mana Forged Arrows and Life Tap, so that Life Tap, because Mana Forged Arrows has a pretty high cost multiplier, Life Tap will zero that out, and then it'll trigger just on cooldown from that point on. Then all you really have to do is just link it up to normal damage stuff, Arrow Nova, Vicious Proj, Void Manipulation, all that stuff. Now, you do want to have a mana cost on your Toxic Rain. This is something that's important. You don't want to go all the way down to 0. You want to have enough of a mana cost to be able to trigger Mana Forged Arrows, because if it's all 0, then if your base cast is 0, then you won't be able to trigger Mana Forged Arrows. So you do have to have at least 1 mana cost on your base Toxic Rain in order for that to work. Now, there's one other thing in here that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's Enduring Cry. Enduring Cry, I think, is back, and the reason for this is very simple. Enduring Cry should still generate endurance charges. That is the way that I understand that it works. If I'm mistaken about this, then I guess we'll drop it from the build, but endurance charges have been changed to give, instead of elemental resistances, they give flat elemental damage reduction and also physical damage reduction. And so you can get a fair amount of physical and elemental damage reduction just by having 3 endurance charges whenever you're fighting any sort of rares or uniques. You just hit Enduring Cry, and now you have some endurance charges. Not necessarily something that's mandatory or anything, but definitely something I would consider doing. And you can link that up to Urgent Orders support for very, very easy, like Warcry speed, and you just want to level it up basically as much as you can. And then, once it's too expensive, either strength wise or mana wise, you can just stop there. You can stick with a level 1 if you can. I mean, it doesn't matter. The buff from Enduring Cry isn't really what you care about. We're just trying to get those endurance charges because they add a lot of damage reduction in the same way that Sand Stance adds a lot of damage reduction. It seems a little janky or like a little bit out of left field, but it's really, really good defensive value, and there's no reason not to take it. I mean, you can see how much damage reduction I gained just by ticking on endurance charges. Humongous, right? Why wouldn't you want that? All right, let's wrap this up. I think this league's changes to Toxic Rain are really good. There are definitely some nerfs, but I think the build is going to come through super strong once again. The quality of life is way up compared to Necropolis League, and even if you die to occasional slams or whatever, I'm willing to make that trade. Frankly, just with tier 17s being nerfed and the Necropolis Lantern being turned off, this build and all builds are going to feel way stronger than they did last league. And I actually like Kintsugi and Wind Dancer a lot more than Lightning Coil, so this feels like a return to form. Feels like a more fun version of the build than what it has been more recently. I am a lot more excited about the build than I was last league. I think there's so much potential for Toxic Rain to be stronger and more fun than it has been for the last 4 months at least, and it's definitely still going to be a god tier league starter, and that is great. I'm very happy. That's good for me, that's for sure. All right, if anything else comes up, I will update accordingly, but I think this is a great starting point for anyone who is wanting to league start this in Settler League. It is so good for early zoomy league mechanics like Heist, Expedition, Betrayal, and all the usual stuff. It's going to be great. I still haven't decided whether I'm league starting it or something more melee oriented. It's a really tough decision, and I just genuinely don't know which way I'm going to go. Whenever everything else fails, there's always Toxic Rain. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching, and good luck with your league start. Bye.